Good evening, followers of fear. You're, as you are very likely aware, I've had some new stories published. So I thought I'd take a moment to read from some of them, and maybe if you will like what I read, you'll end up getting the books they're in. Specifically, I'm going to be reading from the Jewish Book of Horror, which contains my short story, The Divorce from God, and Dark Nature, which contains my short story, Natural Predators. Both were published on Halloween, and both books have been getting great reviews. Uh, and obviously, I want these books to do well, so I thought I might read from my stories in them. Just some small snippets, one section for each story, and maybe if you like what you hear, you'll get the book for yourself for the holidays. Crazier things have happened, right? So my first reading will be from the Jewish Book of Horror. I'll be reading from my story, The Divorce from God. And fun fact, this is actually based on an actual crime. There was a rabbi in, I think, New York, maybe New Jersey, a Hasidic rabbi who was basically running a racket involving helping Orthodox women uh, get divorces from husbands who weren't willing to grant them their divorce. A religious divorce, to be more specific. Sugar-free root beer, no caffeine. Love it. Anyway, that he got caught. But the story inspired me because it's not something you normally associate with a rabbi, like being a criminal kingpin. So I thought I would write a story based around that, and it got into the anthology. So without further ado, The Divorce from God by this guy. The phone rang, and Rabbi Itiel Horowitz picked it up. Yes? Abba, your 4 o'clock is here, his daughter Malka replied. Send her in, Horowitz instructed. A moment later, Mrs. Helen Schumacher, a tall and thin woman with the haggard face of someone whom life has suddenly turned on, stepped in and took a seat across from Horowitz. Thank you for agreeing to change my appointment at the last minute, Rabbi Horowitz. Mrs. Schumacher wrung her hands. Even bringing up the time change seemed to make her anxious. My son came down sick unexpectedly, and as soon as I could find a babysitter, it is no problem, Horowitz assured her. But tell me, Mrs. Schumacher, have you thought about my offer regarding your husband? Mrs. Schumacher closed her mouth. Horowitz simply waited. He knew it was difficult for a woman from a religious community where wives were still expected to be obedient to their husbands, to admit that her marriage was in trouble. It was even harder for a wife in those circumstances to say she needed a divorce. Most difficult was when her husband refused to grant a divorce, and she had to resort to other means to gain her freedom. Mrs. Schumacher was the wife of Avram Schumacher, an investment banker who had invested in some bad deals and startups. He had not told his wife that the family finances were in dire shambles and reacted with his fists when she found out. He had since fled to Detroit, leaving Mrs. Schumacher in a precarious situation, not just financially, but also religiously and socially. And that was where Horowitz came into the story. Horowitz was a Toain, an advocate in the Orthodox community's religious court, or Beit Din. For Orthodox Jews, especially the most zealous and religious of Jews, the Haredi, there was no institution better suited to marital counseling than that of a Beit Din. Was why Mrs. Schumacher, who wasn't Haredi but was Orthodox, sought him out. Mrs. Schumacher needed the help of a Twain and the Beit Din to solve her marital issues, which he had discussed with her in previous meetings. In other words, she wanted a divorce. Not a secular one, but a get, a traditional Jewish divorce. However, her husband had to be the one to initiate the process. Without the get, even if a husband and wife were living entirely separate lives and the entire community knew it, she would still be bound to her husband. And a man with a wife in such a situation could torture her for as long as he chose. In this situation, a wife was known as an aguna, or a chained woman, and there was little recourse for her to free herself, except, of course, if she were to seek help from a Beit Din, who had the means necessary to persuade husbands to free their wives. Sometimes those means were of a nature frowned upon by the laws of secular governments, and these days only a few rabbis like Horowitz were willing to go to those lengths, let alone advertised by word of mouth. "Please, Rabbi Horowitz," Mrs. Schumacher pleaded. "I want to be free from him and to seek someone I'm more compatible with. Someone who won't betray my trust. My own synagogue in Beit Din, as well as the synagogue in Beit Din in Detroit, couldn't get Avram to consent to a get. Can you help?" Horowitz was silent for a moment. To Mrs. Schumacher, it must have felt like an eternity. "I can be of service," he said. "I have helped dozens of agunas over the years. When counseling and shaming and other forms of interference prove ineffective, I can persuade a man to grant his wife a get. The means are extreme, but in the end, they are effective." "Really?" Mrs. Schumacher asked, her voice brimming with hope. "Oh, most certainly. I have experience." Horowitz began recounting some of his most memorable cases, all of which involved kidnapping and excessive violence. He smiled as he remembered those cases. No guilt assaulted his soul. After all, the marriage between a man and woman was supposed to mirror the marriage between HaKodesh Baruch Hu and the children of Israel. The husband imitated God by protecting and providing for his wife, and his wife imitated the children of Israel by serving and obeying her husband. They remained faithful to each other and trusted each other to do what was best for their relationship. And thus the Jewish people have been able to survive through the ages. So when a husband perverted the holy state of marriage by abusing his position and making things unbearable for his wife, it was not a shame when she sought a divorce. And when a husband refused to grant a woman a get out of spite or cruelty, any method short of murder to force him to grant it was also mitzvah. He felt no fear admitting all his past exploits to Mrs. Schumacher, whom he'd only met a few times. Not only was she desperate to free herself, he was a well-respected rabbi in the Haredi community. And the Haredi community was a world unto itself, a utopia where all tried to live by the rules of the Torah and of the Holy One, blessed be He. Leaders of this utopia were the rabbis, who could do no wrong, no matter if the secular authorities said otherwise. Thus the community would do its utmost to protect a rabbi doing God's work, even if that meant teaching a lesson to a more lenient but still pious Orthodox woman who may be considering going to the police. Of course, such threats wouldn't be necessary with Mrs. Schumacher. She was wearing a smile that lit up her whole face, clearly grateful that someone would go this far for her. And it was good she was grateful. What he needed to bring up next usually gave pause to some agunas. He cleared his throat. "Of course, to bring this sort of intervention is rather delicate and can be quite costly. So, how much are you willing to pay to see these services are performed?" Another thing he felt no guilt over was charging for his services. After all, engaging a Beit Din to intervene was like engaging a lawyer or any other professional service. At the end of the day, you had to pay for services performed. The smile fell from Mrs. Schumacher's face. Do you have a payment plan?" "I don't have much after what Avram did to our bank account. and my job at the fast food place doesn't pay me very much. But if it's not all at once, I think I could pay you. They fell to discussing the specifics. By the time Horowitz and Mrs. Schumacher had finished working out the details, the poor woman's smile had returned, and she left the office in what seemed like pure joy. Well, not pure joy. There was something else, an emotion that Horowitz could not identify in her smile. But that did not matter. There was work to do, the work of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Alone again, Horowitz pulled out his cell phone and dialed his eldest son, Dominic, who was named after the kind Gentile OBGYN who had delivered Horowitz's eldest son on the side of the road on a trip back from Kiryas Yoel in upstate New York, picked up on the third ring. Shalom, Abba. How are you today? Dominic said. I am good, Baruch Hashem. Horowitz replied. We have work to do, my son. Can you come over after you get off work? And that is the first part of The Divorce from God, which you can find in the Jewish Book of Horror right now. Our next sample comes from Natural Predators, which appears in Dark Nature. So, Natural Predators, well, it's a pandemic story. I didn't think there was still a market for a pandemic story in the middle of a pandemic, but I was proven wrong. Actually, this one was not inspired by COVID-19 at all. Rather, it was inspired by something that happened to me at camp years and years ago. There was actually an epidemic at camp of a stomach virus, and I was the first in my year, in my grade, to get the virus. And I ended up spreading it to most of my year, which it did not make me popular for a hot minute. They still loved me, but they were mad at me for giving them the virus, and I was just like, I got it from someone else. And it wasn't just the camp that got sick, the entire area got sick. And those events, that epidemic just kind of stuck with me. So, and later on, I had the thought of turning it into a story but a story where the epidemic, instead of a stomach virus, is a virus that causes loss of control of your body. Then much later on, during the middle of our current pandemic, I heard about Dark Nature, which is centered around stories about Mother Nature getting back at humanity for basically being awful. And I wrote out this story and submitted it, and it got in. So without further ado, Natural Predators by Rami Unger. And that's what we need to realize. Mankind was never at the top of any food chain. Rather, we're just part of a cyclical link of predators eating prey and then becoming prey themselves. And microbes are our natural predators. Bacteria and viruses kill us as they use us to reproduce. And science may have given us ways to fight back against some of the more common microbial predators, but there are always new ones just waiting to feast upon us. We got that with Ebola, with HIV, with COVID, and now with this NVEC cropping up. The scientist on the radio, who sounded more like a philosopher, laughed humorously. Heh, Mother Nature is a bitch that way, I guess. Lucy couldn't take anymore. She crossed the length of the cabin and turned off Monica Barr's radio. Before Monica could protest, Lucy spun around and shouted, "Why can't you listen to music like normal people do?" She then stormed out of the cabin and onto the porch, where she sat on the stairs with a huff. Immediately, she regretted freaking out at Monica like that and promised to apologize to her later. But what was she supposed to do? Monica always had her portable radio turned to news and talk stations. And for the past week, all the stations have been talking about was a new virus the scientists are calling the MVEC virus. With another huff, Lucy glanced around Camp Wymott's central field. On every cabin porch, campers sat and did nothing but mope. Well, mope and watch each other, their eyes studying their peers for odd tremors or movements in their limbs. That was usually the first sign of MVEC. Where are the counselors? Lucy wondered morosely. You'd think they would be out here keeping us calm and trying to cheer us up. But she knew where they were. They were holed up in the administrative building with Mr. Walden, the camp director. A bunch of college and grad students trying to earn a few bucks for the summer, looking to one guy with a degree in developmental psychology for guidance. Trying to figure out how to move forward this summer when what was to be the latest international pandemic was spreading across New York. Lucy shook her head. As much as she didn't want to focus on MVEC right now, her mind kept coming back to it like a toy train on a circular track. They had first heard of MVEC 3 weeks ago, during the second week of camp. Parents often sent emails to their kids rather than regular letters, even though smartphones weren't allowed at camp. Instead, the counselors printed out the emails at the administrative building before giving them to the campers. Several parents had made mention of some new viral infection popping up in Nova Scotia. Lucy's own mother had brought it up in her email, before assuring her daughter that it was nothing to worry about. Nova Scotia is so far away from where you are now. I'm sure the Canadians will keep this thing contained. They're pretty competent up there. So, Lucy had stopped thinking about it. But then the next week's emails had all said that the new disease had shown up in Maine, just over the border from Nova Scotia. There were still assurances that the kids had nothing to worry about. But there was now a decent tinge of worry in the subtext of the emails. Worry that was as infectious as the virus itself. And then last week, Monica's radio had been blaring news about the new virus, which the scientists were now calling mutative viral encephalopathic, or MVEC. It had moved through Maine and into New Hampshire and Vermont. Symptoms included inability to control your limbs, scaly rashes on the skin, incontinence, progressive aphasia, and finally fever, after which it was likely you were going to die. Of course, boys and girls increased their quarantine jokes. Ray Schroeder kept them all in stitches with plenty of bathroom humor around the incontinence symptoms. However, nobody spoke about the progressive aphasia, let alone made jokes about it. Imagine losing your ability to speak over time. None of them knew a disease like that, and it went without saying that they were frightened. And then there was the death rate. According to some experts studying the disease, MVEC could prove deadlier than COVID-19 had 4 years earlier. Anyone with or who knew someone with suspected symptoms was encouraged to call their nearest hospital and get checked out straight away, lest they spread it to everyone around them. Of course, by the time you got to the hospital, it was likely anyone you came into contact with would have been infected as well. Not that anyone said it aloud. Three days ago, the first cases appeared in Massachusetts and New York, and Camp Wymont was deep within upstate New York, not too far from the Canadian border, where MVEC was spreading like wildfire. That meant the disease could approach the camp from 2 different directions, depending on how bad their luck was. That was when the low hum and anxiety and fear among the campers, as well as the normally brave-faced counselors, became an all-consuming, never-ending feedback whine. With a groan, Lucy stood and started stomping away from the cabin. She'd take out one of the hiking trails and clear her head a bit. She always felt better when she took a walk in the woods. She could lose herself among the trees and imagine she was journeying through the Fangorn forest with the Ents, having amazing adventures with swords and sorcery. It would be better than her current reality, anyway. She started off towards the woods and the hiking trails, a new pep in her step as she put distance between her and the depressive mood behind her. She got about 20 paces from the cabins before a siren rang through the air. There were several different sirens that the campers were taught at the beginning of summer, as well as what to do if they heard them. This one was for bear sightings, in which case they should return to their cabin or get inside the nearest building until the all clear was given. Resigned, Lucy headed back to her cabin just before Monica locked it up. Her mood perked immediately as she saw who was trapped in the cabin with them. Callie Olivetti had a round face and a blonde bob that was real cute. Plus, she was really nice. Lucy enjoyed spending time with her, and while she still thought of herself as probably straight, could not deny that she thought it would be nice to kiss Callie. Whether or not Callie felt the same way was uncertain, but Lucy was happy when she broke away from the other girls to talk to her, especially since this wasn't even Callie's cabin. Hers was 2 buildings over. "So," Callie began, "on top of the bear and everything else, is there any other crap life can throw our way right now?" Lucy laughed despite how little she felt like laughing and pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was thinking a sea monster could rise out of the lake, maybe pull the dining hall in and force us to order in pizza." Callie giggled. "Sounds good. What do you like on your pizza? I'm a bacon kind of girl." They talked for a little while, the wail of the siren and the hubbub of whispering teen girls fading into the background. With someone else to make light of the situation, Lucy felt herself relax a little. That was until one of the other girls in the cabin shouted, "I see police lights!" Intrigued by this new development, all the girls fell silent and gathered around the cabin's front window, which had a great view of both the field and the boys' cabins. Beyond that was a copse of trees, and beyond that was a sloping hill which eventually ended in the entrance of the camp. And sure enough, just barely visible beyond the trees, were flaming red and blue lights. The lights bounced off the roots and trunks of the trees, making it appear like someone was playing with multicolored glow sticks at the very end of the copse. "Why would the cops need to come for a bear?" Monica asked. "It could be an ambulance," Tina Pendleton suggested. "Maybe the bear mauled someone." "Nah, the ambulances in this area have white and orange lights," Annie Burgess replied. "My uncle's a paramedic in town. He told me about it. Those are definitely police lights." "Then why would the police show up for a bear sighting?" Callie asked. "Wouldn't some nature agency show up if a bear was involved?" "Well, I'm sure it'll be all over soon," said Monica, pushing her glasses up her nose. "These bear sightings never last long. The last one was, what? Not even 10 minutes. This one's already due to end." The other girls agreed, and they fell to talking about other things. This gave Lucy a chance to apologize to Monica, and the latter joined her and Callie as they made jokes and waited for the all clear to be given. Except the all clear was never came. As the day continued, the bear siren continued blaring, and the number of flashing lights continued to grow. After a while, cops started fanning out around the camp. Both curious and freaked, some of the campers tried to step outside their cabins and ask what was going on. They were told, in very harsh terms, to stay inside and to not come out until they were told to do so. Hours passed. In the cabin, girls ran out of things to discuss, no idea of what was going on, and no counselors to attempt to reassure them. They went to bed early or buried their noses in books or put in earbuds, whatever they could do to try and cope with what was happening. Lucy took Callie to her bed and let her play on her Nintendo Switch while she read a YA thriller. On another day, she might have found this companionship pleasant, but her joy was lost under the pall of unease permeating throughout the bunk. Dinner time passed and it got dark outside. The only lights came from the floodlights over the lanes and the police cars by the entrance, which at this point made it look like a silent rave was in full swing in the trees. Eventually, around 10 or so, the police lights died down and the bear siren cut out. The counselors soon showed up and started ushering girls from other cabins back to their own. Lucy got her switch back and hugged Callie goodbye before the other girl headed back to her bunk. The campers were then sent to bed, even though none of them had had dinner and some needed to take medication before going to sleep. The whole time, neither Meg nor Susie, the counselors in charge of Lucy's cabin, explained what was going on or why they'd been cooped up in their bunks this whole time. If she had to guess, Lucy thought that the counselors didn't want to worry them. Even so, Lucy and the other girls went to bed worried. Whatever happened, something about today's bear incident hadn't been normal, and these days, anything abnormal was something to be weary of. And that, followers of fear, was the first section of Natural Predators. So I hope you enjoyed that, my followers of fear. Remember, you can get the Jewish Book of Horror and Dark Nature now. They're available to order. Might make a great holiday gift for the horror fan in your life. I refilled the glass. And if anything else comes up, or if there are any other stories I want to read to you, I'll make sure to let you know. So, in the meantime, I'll leave links in the descriptions below for those two books. And until next time, my followers of fear, good night, eat happy Thanksgiving, stay safe, and pleasant nightmares!